Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach, and I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Lee Artz, to discuss media framing. Thank you for joining me.
I'm happy to be here. It's strange to be in this seat.
Yeah, well, it's comfortable on both sides, I hope. Lee, you published an article last year, The Political Economy of Attention, the Associated Press, and the Global Assault on Democracy. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what that was about and how we might use that to better understand what's happening in Ukraine.
Yeah, we certainly want to talk about the Ukraine, but the whole thrust of that, in fact, several of the articles I've written are based upon media framing, which is a whole research tradition that looks at how information is shared with the public through major media, that things are framed in a particular perspective. And there's several parts of media framing, I think, that we need to be aware of. The first is the media frames by defining events. Certain events are depicted as news, and then they're defined. Once those events are defined, the next step is to diagnose the causes. Why did this event happen? What's the cause? Then the third part is to evaluate the participants. Were they acting justly? Were they being egregious? Were they being authoritarian? And then the final thing is, what is the preferred action? Now that we've defined an event, we know the causes, we know who the participants are. What should be done at this point? So in that article, I looked at... If
I could just summarize that for a second. So you're saying then that when there's an international incident of some kind, the news media tend to go through a pattern of stories that focus on different parts and end up looking at where this is going, right? They almost transcend from forensic rhetoric to deliberative rhetoric, if you will, right?
Yes, and I don't think that each individual reporter goes down this checklist that says, I'm going to define this and diagnose the causes and evaluate. But in the process of doing the objective journalism, this is what happens. Robert Entman and others, it's a long research tradition, has determined this may not be intentional, but the news media in general seems to fit these four functions of reporting on news.
And Entman in particular takes a similar view of this. One of his books is Democracy Without Citizens, and I think he argues in there that this process sort of overrides the natural process that should happen of people just talking about things and developing the discussion in whatever direction they should naturally go in. Right?
That could be another whole show about public access to the media. But that's right. We're subject to the information that is given to us from the commercial media in the U.S. and from state media in other countries.
So these patterns of coverage then actually influence our patterns of deliberation as citizens.
Oh, absolutely. It's going to affect our policy. And that's in the article that you mentioned. I looked at the media coverage of the Crimea crisis in 2014, of the Syria missile attack, and then of the Venezuela elections, and how the media framed each of those. And this frame was there. They would define an event, diagnose the causes, evaluate the participants, and then recommend some particular action. And it was very interesting to me. And when I began to read about the Ukraine crisis, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it struck me that many of these same things were occurring. Again, maybe not with the conscious intent of the journalist or the reporter, but there's several practices that always appear, always. And that makes sense from the point of view of a reporter. What sources am I going to use to tell the story about this controversy or this conflict?
And with an international incident, they're limited to, as reporters, to interviewing experts, and the experts are people who have worked for the State Department at some point or studied at Georgetown University, right? And so they've got a limited pool of people they can talk to, and they tend to get similar reactions from everybody, right?
Yeah, and that was true in the cases of each of those I met. The interesting thing for me about the coverage of Ukraine is it breaks most of the traditional norms. And I think there's a reason for that, and there's also a consequence. Normally, like in the war in Iraq or the coverage of Venezuela or the coverage of Syria, the sources that were preferred, that were privileged, were U.S. State Department, as you said, and academic experts that shared a similar perspective. In the case of the Iraq War, less than 8% of the sources in any news report over a period of time were actually Iraqi citizens. The very strange thing about the Ukraine crisis is that more than 50% of the sources that are cited in the newspaper are by citizens. And you probably have...
So this is sort of the equivalent of a man in the street interview. Is that what you're saying? That
Yes.
Suddenly this is now part of the dialogue?
Well, yes, but the interesting thing is even though there would be Iraqis that would be quoted, they would tend to be Iraqis that supported U.S. involvement in Venezuela or Syria or Iraq.
Yeah.
The interesting thing here is that the huge number of citizen sources, the public voice, the vox populi of the Ukrainians, but it had a particular character, and the character was always condemning the Russians, talking about the tragedy, talking about how they were being subjected to an illegal assault, and then would talk about their personal situation. I remember on the radio, I listened to NPR, and there was a radio interview, and a man's in his car, and he's driving away, and he says he's with his family, and the reporter says, well, who's with you now? And, oh, my wife is, and my daughter. Well, how old's your daughter? 8? And can I talk to her? Does she speak English? So they had to talk to the daughter to see that she was scared, and things were bad. And so the whole thrust of this was the heavy emphasis on the civilians and the public was to create sympathy, which it would, obviously. But you didn't see that when the U.S. invaded Iraq. You don't see that now with Saudi Arabia bombing Yemen. You don't see stories in the New York Times that are featuring the disaster it has meant for daily life of the average citizen.
So, if we were to speculate here, is this because we're covering a war that involves Europeans and not Arabs and South Americans, right? Is it? Do we look at this differently because we relate to them more?
Well, the U.S. media and the Western media relates to it differently, certainly, and every media that I've studied, I looked at the media framing of the French attack on Mali. The French media gave the line of the French government. When I looked at Israel's bombing of Gaza in 2014, the Israeli media and the U.S. media took the side of the Israeli government. The interesting thing here is this is not a U.S. or U.K. war. This was a Russian war.
Right.
So the perspective is one of you're not going to have you find very few Russian sources. I mean, even with objective reporting, you're supposed to have this position, that position. No, because you can't talk to the Russians because they're obviously doing propaganda and they're evil and they're trying to expand. So you don't need that. So what you substitute is the civilians. Right. And it pulls at your heartstrings to think about people fleeing and putting all their belongings in the back seat of the car and the little girl and the dogs back there. It's really a sad scenario.
Yeah, and there have been people looking at this going back to World War II, and pointing out that when the United States is at war, it's difficult for the news media to follow those standard rules. They sort of fall in line. So it sounds like you're saying we're almost treating this as if we're at war here. We're covering it, more from a personal perspective, if you will, right? We're looking at the people as if they were.
They're taking the position of the U.S., which at this point is the position that NATO should be able to expand. Yeah. So U.S. and NATO are the good in this case. So anything that will be reported will be from the U.S. perspective or the NATO perspective. Yeah. In fact, the coverage in the last 4 weeks of the Russian invasion, like I said, 50% were Ukrainian citizens, but 30% were NATO or the U.S. Very few were EU, actually, except the ones that were with NATO. And about 10% were Russian. This is a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, but Russia gets about 10% of the sources, whereas the U.S. and NATO gets more than 30% of the sources, which is a really, and again, it's not necessarily intentional. It's like you say, I have to have a source. Yeah. Who's best to know about this? Well, it's a question of NATO, so I should talk to NATO. It's a question of U.S. sanctions, so I should talk to the U.S. I can't talk to Russia. I can't get there. I don't speak
and why
Russian.
Can't they? I mean, would they not get cooperation if they wanted Russian sources?
Well, I think they would, but they would discount it. Like they've been able to cover recently the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, but that's pretty much been dismissed. well, Russia has said this, but they don't mean it because we can't trust the Russians.
Right.
And the Ukraine said that, but Ukraine is under pressure, so we can't do. And the response from the White House and all of the media has been, well, I mean, if we take it even a step further, because one of the other things that happens is not just the sources. Even if you have balanced sources, one of the things that happens in media coverage is they're going to tell us what we should make of these balanced sources.
Sure.
So,
and this came out of the 60s because the news media was accused of not adequately covering civil rights and the war protests and things, and so they really took it upon themselves to try to take an extra step past that
if
point.
you think back to the women's movement, I don't know where it came from, but they were bra burners. And you think about the environmental movement, they're tree huggers.
Yeah.
And you think about civil rights, well, they're playing the race card, right? So you get these ways of describing particular components. In the case of the Ukraine.
But those examples you give, though, I mean, those were expressions that people were using. I mean, they didn't just come out of the media. I mean, that was...
People didn't use them until they were in the media, just like now. Nobody was flying a blue and yellow flag for Ukraine until we were flooded with U.S. propaganda.
Well, let's take this apart. I mean, how do we get there? I mean, is it fair to say that they're looking at this, they're covering this not as if it's a war between two other countries, but as if we're involved in it? They're covering it from the point of view of Ukraine exclusively, right? Because
well, except also the point of
adversaries with Russia for so long.
Right. The point of view also of the U.S., because the U.S. says that this is a question of NATO and protecting Western civilization.
So do you see this as a kind of yellow journalism here? Or are they just they giving into the temptation to hype this? I mean, it is a pretty serious
it's an illegal
story. One country's invaded another, regardless of how you look at it. There's no justification for that, right?
That's right.
How much more objective do you expect them to be?
Well, I think that you have to, at least at a very minimum, you have to give some historical context.
And that's what I understand that's what we haven't gotten and what we're not getting right now.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we should talk about that a little bit. So, and before we go into this, I mean, I just want to make it clear, we're not trying to justify Russia invading Ukraine.
No,
by any
it's
means.
an illegal intervention. It violates international law. But the interesting thing for me is
we haven't gotten full coverage of what led up to it, right?
Yes, and also there is not the same standard that's applied to the U.S. The U.S. has had 32 missile attacks in Somalia this year, which is a violation of international law. The U.S. is arming Saudi Arabia. They have killed 380,000 people in Yemen in an illegal war that's been condemned by the UN. Right. But you don't see people flying Yemen flags. You don't see daily reports in the media about the Yemeni citizens that are being bombarded by U.S. weapons and Saudi planes.
But, I still go back to newspapers are their businesses. They have to sell newspapers, and they're selling them to people who want to read about Ukraine and probably aren't as interested in these other countries. Now,
nobody knew where Ukraine was.
Maybe they have a moral responsibility to report these things, but I can understand why they're not getting the equal coverage.
Well, one is Ukrainians are white, blonde-haired, and blue-eyed, and they look like Europeans. That's a big part of it.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's a big part of it.
CBS reporter even said that. They've said this on more than one occasion. The head of the European Parliament said that these are not people from the Mideast.
Implying that would be okay, right?
Well, yes, they're used to war, they're used to conflict, but these are nice European. They could be our neighbor, is one of the things they said. So, but if you're going to say we have these objective standards that if international law is violated, that should be in the news, but it's never been in the news when the U.S. has done that. The U.S. has violated. Continuing in Iraq today, and Afghanistan today, and in Haiti today, and in Nicaragua today.
You have to take into account what people want to read and view. I remember the great example of this was during the O.J. Simpson trial, and everybody was complaining there was O.J. on TV all the time. They were so tired of hearing it. But why were all these stations running this? Because that's what people wanted to watch. They'd complain about it at work, and then they'd go home and put their TV on and try to find the channel that was covering the trial.
Yeah,
they're a business. They're like they're like McDonald's. People want to buy hamburgers, so McDonald's keeps.
Yeah, but nobody with a refined palate eats at McDonald's. Kids can grow up and they learn to like Twinkies.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that's a balanced diet.
Right.
Yes, the American public has been weaned on spectacle.
Yeah.
and misinformation
Yeah.
and nationalism.
Yeah, going back over 100 years.
Oh,
yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. So that's not unusual. But as a media scholar, or as somebody that's interested in the public good
Right.
and democracy, we should call this to task. Say, okay, if you're going to say that about this invasion, why didn't you say that about this invasion?
I hear you.
And the
I
next
hear you.
one. And that's
What don't we know about the Ukraine?
well, this one right
situation?
here, we don't know. Most people don't know
Yeah.
that in 1991, George Bush and James Baker told Gorbachev, NATO will not move 1 inch east. And I'm not making this up. You can read this in the National Security Archives at George Washington University. The documents are there. But then it expanded. In 1999, NATO bombed Yugoslavia. In violation of international law, they divided Yugoslavia into 6 countries, and they took a thing called Kosovo, which is parallel to the Donbass in Ukraine, and they made it a separate country. And then they've expanded all the way up to Russia's border. From 1999, they've added 12 countries to NATO.
Yeah.
So that's part of the...
And this is provocative action if you're in Russia.
Well,
Yeah.
again, it's not me saying this. This
Yeah.
is what George F. Kennan said. This is what Henry Kissinger said. This is what the Joint Chiefs of Staff said. Don't do it. Don't do it.
Henry
It's a
Kissinger
bad.
says this. Why isn't anybody covering it?
It's like if it didn't happen last week, it's not news.
Well, there's that. That's always
So
a factor. Yeah.
yes, but this is, I mean, it's interesting.
I think they would report it if Ukraine had attacked Russia, right? I mean, it would become more relevant. But Ukraine's on the defensive.
Yes, Yemen was on the defensive and still is. Somalia's on the defensive. Iraq was on the defensive. Afghanistan's on. Haiti's on the defensive.
Yes, I
The
know.
interesting thing is you have a double standard, but this one, if you make this critique, somehow you're un-American or you're an apologist for Putin or you're unpatriotic. It's very
It's
difficult
like
to
we're
have.
at war. I mean, it seems to me we're treating it as if we're the ones who are at war.
Well, I would argue that the military contractors and military producers see it that way.
Yeah.
I mean, after Russia invaded, their stocks just jumped high, and now Germany's buying, I don't know what the number was, 100 billion euro or 100 million euro worth of military equipment, and the U.S. is shoveling military equipment into, where's that coming from?
Yeah.
That's coming from the U.S. budget, and it's going into the pockets of Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics and Boeing. That's where that money is going. And again, that's not presented as newsworthy.
But are you assuming, though, that the average citizen wants to hear all that? I'm still stuck on that.
The average
because-
citizen needs to hear that.
Yeah,
They need to hear that.
But, you know, I mean,
That's
one
the
of
argument
the
that
principles of
people-
democracy is that we don't tell people what they need to know and what they should do with the
No,
information.
but we also
right?
don't. We also don't suggest that should be censored so they don't hear it. That's one of the campaigns, even in our state.
Right.
The state legislatures considering a resolution so that at P&W and at public schools you can't talk about the racial history of the United States because it's not something that people want to hear.
Yeah.
That's censorship. That's censorship.
So we're talking about a systemic problem here, right?
Absolutely.
Reporters, they're taught to follow the rules of objective journalism and they don't always, granted,
No,
right?
no, even
But-
if they do, but
But
that's
to get both sides, and that sometimes that hurts a story if they overdo it. I mean, one person in a neighborhood can be opposed to a Walmart coming in, and that one person will get equal time in the local news
presumably,
story,
right.
because they've got to get both sides of the story. So that they err on the other side sometimes too.
Right,
But,
except when we're talking about international events. The thing I published,
Yeah.
the coverage of Crimea, the coverage of Syria. In the case of Syria, there were twice as many sources that were U.S. or EU as there were Syrian sources.
Yeah.
And this is an attack on Syria, but they don't measure up. They don't get equal time. They didn't get equal
Right,
quotes.
right.
And I'm not questioning that they got the quotes accurate, but that makes you a secretary, not a journalist. And that's the big problem.
So, just to break it down a little bit, I mean, obviously there are some news sources and there's some news channels that are less ethical than others. Some are more ethical. We're not implying, like our former president did, that they were all one entity.
No, and I'm not
common
challenging
willpower
it.
or anything, right?
I'm not
But we're
challenging
talking
it.
about systemic developments here that tend to sort of interfere with our awareness of what's going on as citizens, essentially.
And that's
right?
why I'm saying there's several practices.
Yeah.
And the media framing occurs because there's several dominant practices. One is reliance on official sources, particularly official sources of the country in which you live.
Right, right.
So you can't just hold the U.S. responsible. The second thing is effort to make sure that you're going to describe negatively or positively who are the participants in this particular event. And then the biggest thing is you don't have any context for the average reader or viewer to understand what's going on.
I mean, I don't doubt that it works the way you're describing it. I guess I just have trouble. You know, I was a reporter for a couple of years, and I got out of, I was in journalism school, and they didn't tell me I had to check with anyone before I wrote my stories. And when I worked as a reporter and editor at a couple of papers, I was never told, check with me before you decide what to write about, or make sure you cover it from this point of view, right? So I know that if you're in the system there's no overt hand on your shoulder, directing you to do those things. But I also know at the same time that if the United States is involved in a war, or if Ukraine's involved in a war with our enemy, that you're going to feel, as a human being, you're going to feel unpatriotic if you don't cover it pretty much from the side of the United States.
Yeah,
so I think that's going to influence
feel pressure. You're going to feel pressure from the coworkers, and you may not get assigned that again. Peter Arnett won an award for his, I don't know if it was a Pulitzer or some other award, for his coverage of the first Gulf War. In the second Gulf War, he was doing the same thing, and he was fired. He was fired.
Yeah.
No, sometimes,
you're right? You're right,
Gary Webb, who worked for the San Jose Mercury News, reported on the connection between the CIA and drug running in the Contras in Nicaragua. He was fired, and then he was castigated. So there's a lesson there.
Okay, but break that down. How did he get fired? What was the process? Who fired him?
The San Jose Mercury News fired him.
And why?
They claimed that he had taken on a political campaign that was beyond the task of a journalist, even though his documentation was beyond repute. And then a lot of people dumped on him. Other journalists dumped on him.
Yeah. And why do you think that happened?
Well, I think if we were to talk about the academe, I think that we have colleagues that are always in favor of whatever the administration wants to do, because they see that that's the best way forward.
Right.
You've worked at places, you've worked with journalists, you've worked in PR firms, where some people are making sure that the boss knows they're on the boss no matter what.
And this is true in all
all
facets of life.
In the papers I've cited, Washington Post tends to be more conservative than the New York Times, which is said to be a liberal newspaper.
Right.
But they follow the same media framing, reliance on official sources, descriptors that will make sure that the reader and the viewer knows who to support, and don't give us any context to understand it all.
It's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy thing, because once the story's been covered, that defines what's newsworthy, right? And then anybody covering it past that point tends to follow up on that. And I think you make a really good point. Then it tends to go in certain directions. It's almost like Kubler-Ross's death and dying process, right? I mean, we're all different people, but when we have this experience, we tend to go through these stages.
And what happened after 9/11 when the U.S. invaded Iraq? All the journalists had to wear a little flag on their lapel.
Yeah, right.
If they wanted to go on TV, they had to have that flag.
Yeah.
Because if they weren't, the viewers would say, you're not being patriotic, and the boss would say, you can't go on unless you wear the flag.
And that's the viewers dictating what's happening, not the
But I would argue that is a cultivated preference, a cultivated understanding. You can't possibly, right? I mean, I don't remember the man's name. The more you watch, the less you know.
Yeah, right.
Right? The more you watch, the less you know. The more you read, the less you know. That's not necessarily true, because you probably can get more information from print media than you can from the broadcast media, because broadcast media has to do it within 30 minutes, and there's like a minute and a half for a particular story, and then we go on to another lighthearted story before we come back to a heavier one. But yes, you're right. It's about the structure. It's the system of the media that's based on a business that has to deliver spectators to the advertisers.
It tends to repeat itself.
Yes,
Yeah.
and you're in this culture. We're in a culture where the most respected group in the United States is the military. Nobody trusts politicians.
Possibly debatable, but
Well, that's what the Gallup suggested, that the
Yeah.
military officials are one of the few things where the majority of Americans have some confidence in. They don't have much confidence in either of the political parties. There's a loss of confidence in churches. There's a loss of confidence in
Professors.
in schools and professors,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay.
Loss of confidence in the media. But, so in that context,
yeah,
to talk about U.S. military actions in country A, B, or C bumps up against a culture of the U.S. is always a force for good, right?
Yeah.
The U.S. is always doing humanitarian things.
Well, that's all the time we have for a program. Lee and I have this discussion on an ongoing basis, so we can pick this up again at a later date. Thank you to Dr. Lee Artz for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.